Hello and welcome everyone to the Solo Multimedia Podcast where I give you my unfiltered take straight off the cuff. And today I'm going to be talking about the video game SOMA. So first things first, I really debated and went back and forth over whether to even cover this because essentially the idea is for that I wanted for this podcast to be mostly like, first impressions, kind of like play the first part of a game or like your first listen of an album or first watch of a film. You get the point, right? Just a kind of raw emotional kind of like first impression of something. And I've actually finished Soma. It's not a particularly long game though, so I guess that makes it slightly easier to justify. But either way, I decided I would talk about it because I think it's got a lot of interesting ideas. And I will say as well, I've had a bit more time to sit with what Soma does. I've had more time to think and ponder over it essentially. So I have a bit more to say. But basically, for those who don't know, Soma is a first person, I guess you could say, survival horror game. It's made by the same guys who made Amnesia, so if you're familiar with that, there'll be a lot of similarities, I guess. But I guess I'll start off with probably my biggest criticism. I don't really know what, like, the gameplay in this game is very puzzle based, and you're kind of walking around these big rooms trying to figure out a solution or like work out what you need to do to progress to open a door, to fix a lift, whatever. Usually while some kind of monster lurks in the room and you have to kind of like figure out how to avoid them, figure out how to hide from them, all that good stuff. And I don't think that this element of the game is done like especially well. I felt like Amnesia did it better, and I wasn't the biggest fan of Amnesia, even though I know a lot of people really loved that game, and I understand why, but just wasn't massively for me. But basically in this game, I feel like it makes less sense, and considering the other elements of the game, which are what made me want to talk about this game in the first place, I don't know why it's kind of put in the way it is. I feel like if you want to go for the horror angle, you could have done it in a more naturalistic way. There didn't need to literally be a bunch of monsters chasing you down or something. It could have been like, I don't know, like the collapse of the place you're in, because essentially, just to give the story real quick, you start the game and you're just some random dude going in for a brain scan of some kind because you have some kind of head injury. It's never particularly, it's never spelled out especially as to what your injury is or what the brain scan's for especially. But what ends up happening is you go for the brain scan, you go and sit down in the chair, and then all of a sudden your character wakes up in an underwater like nightmare sci-fi facility where everything's disheveled and gone to hell essentially. Just imagine like BioShock and the world of Rapture. It's a very similar vibe, except you just wake up in a chair there basically. And yeah, from this point on you explore a story that very much explores like the concepts like digitalized consciousness, sentience, and what that even means. Broadly, these are the philosophical kind of things it touches on. And I think it does this element of it really, really well. So if anybody hasn't played the game, I'd probably recommend it if you're into... I would consider this game to be mostly a walking simulator. If you find yourself especially scared of games like this, then it will be like a very standard survival horror game. But I feel like a lot of people will see this as a bit of a walking simulator in a way, or at least that's how it came across to me, because essentially all the puzzles in the game are pretty simple. It's more or less just go find the MacGuffin and then plug it into something. Or alternatively, it's, work out how to interface with this sci-fi future UI thing to unlock something or something like that, right? It's all very basic stuff. None of it will halt many people for too long, I don't think. It won't be that frustrating. So if this sounds up your alley, if you're into like the concepts in philosophy that I've described, if you're into this aesthetically, I would recommend this, and you should probably not listen beyond this point. But I can't really discuss what I want to discuss without talking about the story more in depth. So I'm going to assume all those people have left, and now I'm going into spoiler territory. So basically, what ends up happening is you discover that you have awoken in this underground facility, because what happened is the brain scan you went in for was actually a scan of your consciousness, or at least this is the way it's been used. I don't know if it was necessarily intended to be used like this when it was done, but you're 100 years in the future, and you're essentially just a rebirthed consciousness of yourself with all your memories, and you've been put in a robot, right? And basically, the facility you're in is the final bastion of human hope, essentially. It's gone to shit because there's been a kind of an AI that's kind of like managed to break into the physical world and caused a bunch of shit to happen. It is like the long and short of it, essentially. But the core of the story is based around the fact that you're a digital consciousness and you're having like this kind of very human experience, and throughout the game, you know, you're going to have to kill robots that have sentient AI in them or brain scans of other people, functionally the same thing as you, but you're constantly told by your companion that, you know, these aren't like us, they're just, you know, they're not even brains in a vat. Some of them were made to be AI. They weren't even people to begin with. They're different from us, all that kind of stuff. And you get, as a result of this kind of like core conflict of you as a player experiencing this form of consciousness, and that, you know, kind of clashing with having to essentially make peace with the fact that you've killed other robots that are very similar to you. That's kind of the clash at the core of the game, really. And it really comes to a head at a couple different points. So there's one sequence that I fucking loved. I thought it was actually pretty brilliant. Essentially, there's a section in the game where you need to get a security code for a door, and you don't know any way to get it other than by speaking to someone who actually might have the code. But obviously all the humans are completely gone. They're just no longer about. The only one you run in contact with is a digitalized consciousness that was in a robot, and then you've put them into your Omni tool, which is your kind of like your like, I don't know how you describe it. It's an Omni tool. It does a lot of different things. It's like your, I don't know, pass for the doors, essentially, is the main thing it's used as, and it activates a couple different bits of equipment and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, it's an Omni tool. It's a multi-purpose tool. But yeah, she's kind of like on that after you take her out of the robot and continue with her, because she's essentially a very important person at this facility. So she has a lot of information, can help you out. And she tells you that, okay, everyone's been digitalized and is no longer here, but if we can find the brain scan of the person who knows and wake them up in an artificial environment on a computer, then perhaps we can get the information out of them. And what I really loved about this sequence is that when you initially load them into the PC, you see them on a screen and they wake up and they're like, hey, what's going on? Like, where am I, kind of thing? Because they've essentially, this is the continuation of after they were scanned. So you've had a person who's been physically scanned and then put onto a PC, but the PC, the consciousness on the PC doesn't have any experience after that. So the second you plug them in, it's the equivalent of that person waking up. But because you're waking them up in a PC, you don't know what environment they were, you know, put to sleep in. So if you wake them up in one of the various options, so you've got like a ski resort, a beach, stuff like that, immediately they get incredibly stressed and confused. Which I thought was just a really, really cool little idea. And what you have to do is you have to discover more about this person to create an environment and replicate that in which they'll feel comfortable, so you can get the code out of them. And the reason they're cautious, by the way, is because I assume everyone had their scan after the point at which everyone knew that this AI had kind of gone rogue. So everyone is, you know, very cautious of this fact and doesn't want the AI to get any intel so they can destroy all of these brain scans of people, essentially. That's essentially why this person is so overly cautious when dealing with you. Yeah, that's pretty much like the core of the game. But the thing I find incredibly fascinating is you couldn't really have told this story if it wasn't a video game. And this is something that clicked after thinking about it for a little while, because initially, after I beat the game, what happens is, so one thing I've skipped over is the reason that everyone's getting their brain scanned is because the plan is that basically, so the Earth's fucked. It no longer has any humans. This is the last of humanity. We're going to take a bunch of brain scans. We're going to put you all into a digital world called the Ark, which is like a perfect utopia, like digital world that people can exist in. And we're going to fire the server that holds it off into space so that nothing on Earth can destroy it, nothing can fuck with it. The satellite that it's attached to essentially has a bunch of like solar panels, so it can stay charged for like, you know, hundreds of thousands of years using the sun's energy and that kind of thing. So that's what the project is about. And one of the things that happens throughout the game is basically you realise as a player, okay, well, it's 100 years in the future, there's no way I'm going to get to go back to my old life, so I might as well try and get on the Ark, is essentially your goal after a certain point. And what happens is, as a result of this journey, at multiple points you have to take a brain scan so that your consciousness can be transferred into something else. The first time this happens is to get into a different suit, and what happens is your character, you essentially sit down, have a brain scan, and as a player experiencing the game, the screen goes black and then you reawaken and it comes back in this new body, but you hear your old self still talking. And the implication there, or not even implication, just overtly what happened, is that obviously your old consciousness continued. There was still continuity there, but you've essentially created a replica of yourself. And the one you experience is the replicated version. So you're no longer the original consciousness, but at the same time, you kind of are, because you're a perfect replication of everything that brain contained, essentially. So from your perspective, you have all the memories implanted in this new you, so to speak. So it feels like a perfect continuation of what you were experiencing before. But what ends up happening is obviously this splits off into two people, and this freaks out the protagonist because he isn't aware of this, despite the fact that it has been explained to him. And that is something you couldn't do in a film or in any other medium, I don't think, really, where you have the player literally fall asleep and wake up in a new shell, and you can experience that kind of passing of consciousness, that continuity of consciousness. And I thought that was really, really cool and really well executed as well. In the end, though, unfortunately, the end is a bit, I don't know, I found it a little bit, tiny bit silly. I still felt like it was a good ending after thinking about it for a bit, but basically what happens is you manage to get to the Ark, you rescue it from the last actual living person, you bring it to the launch, like the launch pod or whatever, where it will fire it off into space, and you sit down, and the lady that you've been carrying around with you tells you that she's attached the brain scan to the launch button. So you hit the launch, and then the launch starts, and also you start getting copied over to the Ark. You get copied over, and your character celebrates because he can see the loading bar, and he's like, "Oh my god, I fucking made it! I don't believe it." It launches, and you're still sitting down in your seat. And the character, yet again, is quite annoyed. He's like, "What the fuck? Why am I still here? What happened?" But obviously, he should really understand it by this point. Like, you just had a brain scan, and the exact same thing happened earlier, only you were transferred into a different body. This time, you're just being uploaded to a server. But yeah, you know this. Your continuity essentially is split into two different things. You've made a clone, a scan, it's not like a passing of the same consciousness, so to speak. So I found it maybe a little bit silly that he was like shocked at the outcome, I guess. But regardless, I thought it was a really cool story, a really cool exploration of the ideas that were presented. I don't think the gameplay was necessarily all that. I kind of just treated it as a walking simulator, like I said, which is fine, because ultimately there were enough details throughout the world. Like, there were plenty of computers with people's stories and explorations of these subjects in general, that it didn't ever feel like boring or anything like that. There was plenty to chew on at pretty much all points in the game. I guess the only other thing I want to say is there were a couple really cool points that really show that the game wants you to think about these questions. So one of the reoccurring things is you'll find a survey on a computer, and it will ask you questions about how you feel about how do you feel about where you are? Are you okay with being a brain scan on the Ark? And it asks this at like 3 different points in the game. One, before you really know what's going on, you just know that there are digitalized consciousness and you know that you are a robot. The second time, I think, is after you get cloned, and then the third time is when you're actually on the Ark in the post-credit scene. So after it launches and you get stuck behind, there's a credit sequence, then after that you actually wake up in the Ark and get to experience what it's like, and it asks you the same questions again. And I think the purpose of these is basically, I don't even think, this is almost definitely just true. The purpose of this is to get the player to stop and think how they'd actually feel in this situation, because playing it through a game is a pretty good way to experience it to some extent. So yeah, I thought that was a really, really cool little touch as well. Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I want to say about this game. It's not perfect by any stretch, but it's short and sweet, has a lot of ideas to chew on, and I think other people will probably get more out of the puzzles and more out of the kind of monsters and cat and mouse chase game type thing that they have going on than I did. So if that sounds like your vibe, definitely consider giving this one a check, or giving this one a look, I guess. And yeah, cheers for listening. I'll see you all around in the next one, hopefully. Peace out, everybody.